Hello, everybody, and welcome to Before Our Friends Die, the podcast where I have the conversations I want to have before I leave this planet because they're important, because they're urgent, and because, more than anything else, they're interesting. You're joined by me, Kavan, and this is the akhi&saltfish Digital Network. And today, Miri, my guest, I was just about to say to you, I don't know how you have enough time in the day because genuinely, I don't know where to start with this introduction. So if you don't mind, I'm going to hand over to you because I want to make sure you get out the most salient points of your identity right at the start. But your roster of accolades is incredible. So over to you. Please do introduce yourself to the network.
That is too kind, and thank you so much. And anyone who's listening in, I'm a busy working mum, and I think all of us that are busy working parents, we just juggle, don't we? But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me along today, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you. I'm Miri Firth. I'm based at the University of Manchester. I am an expert on employability and flexible assessment. So those are really the two things that I work and really enjoy looking into. And most recently, I've been doing an awful lot of work around AI in education. I think, honestly, I'm sure yourself is the same. You can't avoid AI, Gen
No.
AI in education at the moment. And I'm not coming to that from a point of jumping on bandwagons, but for employability, I see it as an absolutely core and crucial employability skill. We've got to all get to grips with this. And in order for assessment to really work well, we've got to mitigate against any potential poor use of AI. And that's where flexible assessment comes in. So really weirdly, it kind of came at a point for me, an expert in both those areas, that it kind of intersects really perfectly. So yeah, I do love working with people, and you will see me out and about quite a bit. But yeah, thanks so much for welcoming me today.
Not at all. And can I just say as well, for anyone listening, I'm coming at this as a fan, okay? I'm not here to challenge or critique. I literally want to pick your brain today because I met you at a conference in, I think it was November last year, and
It
there were a few
was,
things
yeah.
you shared that genuinely resonated with not just me as someone who works in HE, but me as a student 10 years ago. That, like, I reflect now on my time in higher education, and every assessment period was genuinely scary. It was like, okay, this is the time when I'm going to get found out. They're obviously going to fail me on this one. I'm just, and actually, the opening question on your presentation was, give me a word that describes how you felt about assessment. And most people in the room said like terrified, worried,
Yeah.
anxious, all these sort of negative associations. And the key thing I left your presentation with is assessment doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah.
Why did so many people in the room, and I'm sure most rooms you enter, feel that way? What are we getting wrong?
Well, I think ultimately it's still coming from previous experiences. It isn't always the institutions, the universities that students are coming into. It's, quite often previous experiences. So if you've been through a school system or been through other exams, it's a really scary point. And quite often we're told that in order to move and progress, we have to pass this thing. So from my own perspective, I think it is very much from previous experience that we get that. But I think one of the hardest shifts that we have in higher education is trying early doors to make that shift with our students into being more co-producers and more colleagues in this space. Because quite often it isn't about us going, do you know this and can you answer this correctly? It's often, can you complete this correctly? Can you identify things that will be appropriate, correct, or incorrect, but doing so in a way that is about, pursuing new knowledge and actually developing things rather than it being as straightforward a black and white yes and no answer. And if I may say, I was similarly, one of the things I found really quite challenging in my studies is if I had exams, and as you've seen in my presentations and online work, I really like working with people. I'm a chatter, I really like working in teams and being with people. It's my nightmare to sit still and be quiet and try and get things in my head down on paper. So honestly, like for me, it was the situation that scared me, not necessarily what I knew. And that's why it's such a powerful thing to look at flexible assessment, because in our original study, we found so many positives associated with the uses of flexible assessment in that students are then given that new motivation and that new sense of agency that, hang on, I'm not having to prove what I know. And like you said, it's not a case of putting someone in a position of fear where they think that they've got to be right or wrong or potentially found out. As you've said, it's about showcasing knowledge. Let's share this together, let's work together. I might be in university, you might be in university, but our students become our colleagues while they're with us. Their knowledge is as valid, their positions and their critical thinking is as valid, so we've got to really champion that through assessment.
I'll tell you what, one of the things, if I'm reflecting back based on what you've said there, to be fair, I don't think they were trying to catch me out, on reflection. And I think a lot of it was that it felt like it was a framework that I had to fit within. It felt like, but even by virtue of things like referencing, I know obviously referencing has complete need.
Absolutely.
I'm not against referencing, but for me, it was a new thing. I'd never had to do it before. So learning that felt like, okay, this is where I'm going to trip up and this is where I'm going to get exposed. And it's only now, when I'm a decade removed from studying formally, that I feel far more confident about my identity and strengths as a learner. And what I hear from you is something you said in your presentation. This is about shaping professional identity. It's not just assessment for assessment's sake, but once they have the confidence to say, actually, I know I can show my skill set better here rather than here, that in itself is professional identity. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, and particularly how it's received by perhaps your colleagues?
Yes, certainly. And I think it's part again of the work that I've now done since we met. I mean, that conference in November was amazing, and it was great to meet yourself and lots of other colleagues. But the reason why I went to present there around employability and assessment was that we just launched our national framework for flexible assessment, which was off the back of our original study. And it's unbelievable. Last week, I actually counted up. I'm now supporting 25 institutions on this. So, some of the data we've got is just incredible.
Yeah.
And it really is about thinking about flexible assessment in its widest sense. So we defined in our project 12 different types of flexible assessment that can be applied, but is probably already there. And the key thing that we need to do across our sector is not just, it isn't redo things, first of all. So I think my first message to colleagues is, anything in our research on flexible assessment isn't about changing things, it isn't about doing more, and it isn't about upsetting any of our accreditors or changing anything that we need to get assessed there. What it is about showcasing your flexibility in your assessment, which is probably already there, and it certainly is from the work I've been doing across the sector. And once you have then opened up that discussion with those learners, it enables them to start or continuing developing their professional identity by realizing, okay, this isn't just a point where I'm going to be right or wrong. This isn't a point where there is power imbalances where I'm being judged. This is actually about me as a professional. I've chosen to study this particular area. I've chosen it perhaps for a vocational reason or perhaps out of curiosity. And it's about developing through assessment, myself as a person, but my professional identity as well, because it's how we're communicating our knowledge ultimately, isn't it? And that also showcases our application, our perception, our history on knowing about these things. It communicates a huge amount.
I love the vision. I love the vision with flexible assessment and the empowerment it gives to the students. And I guess where my brain goes, considering we've got a short period of time, so I don't expect you to solve all these pop-ups in my brain, but the practical side of things is really interesting. And I wonder if there are any examples you can draw on in terms of where flexibility wasn't at the forefront but was already there, and therefore, to use your term, only had to be extracted rather than an add-on. So I know I've used it out of context, by the way, but where are some of the examples you've seen in your experiences whereby flexibility was already embedded or extracted and people didn't realise?
Brilliant question. Yeah. And I think that is the key thing. So this has continued since we saw each other in November. It fascinates me how when we look at flexible assessment, and I discuss this through workshops, and I've done these now with senior leaders for their strategy, for their access and participation plans, for new teachers coming through onto PG Cert HE, and for specific groups, perhaps just in one department. And I think one of the most straightforward areas that everyone will have. Well, there's two actually. The first one is on word count. So quite often if you are writing a piece of work that has a word count, we have that flex in terms of plus or minus 10%. We also have quite often deadlines. So using both of those. So your deadline for your submitted work, which might be, I don't know, the 14th of May, or your plus or minus 10%, both of those have already got flexibility in them, because a student can choose to write more or write less. And a student, believe it or not, can submit up until that deadline. And that's something that, across the sector, everyone recognizes that if there's a deadline, we'll probably submit on the day. And it doesn't matter if we've got that learning style where we are. Yeah, me too. But, it doesn't matter if we've even finished it 3 days before. There's something about that deadline where you're like, oh, no, I can't. Oh, no, I mustn't, And so many of our students have actually got it, and they've got that work finished and they can submit early, and they don't need to overthink or redo things. And I think even going through both of those two forms of flexibility can really empower students and make them go, actually, yeah, I do need to finish this and submit it now because I've got a part-time job, or I need to go off and see family, or I've got a wedding to attend, or whatever. Them managing that time around those assessments, again, can really support and develop that professional identity.
So I guess what I'm hearing in that then is, while the assessment has perhaps inherent ways in which it can be flexible, that culture of seeing and exploiting the flexibility needs to be unearthed earlier, throughout the whole module, throughout the whole experience, because what I hear from you is that's empowerment. And actually, I'm just trying to find some stats here. You've spoken about 71% of staff agree that optionality enhances accessibility, and 86% of students agree or strongly agree that optionality provides a sense of empowerment and increased autonomy. So if that relationship of, hang on, yes, there's a word count and yes, there's a deadline, but you can choose up until this point or up until this number what you submit, that will feed its way into someone taking more ownership of their learning. Have I captured that right?
Yeah, that is absolutely bang on. Yeah. And that's why we didn't just leave the project, or I didn't just leave the project as something sat with our quality assurance agency, because what I saw as just being so powerful to so many diverse learner groups in lots of different settings and contexts. And that's why I'm delighted to support more institutions on that, because our sector is in such great fluctuation at the moment. And if there's one way that we can really support our learners and add even more value to their time with us and studies, I think it is through showcasing flexible assessment and through empowering their learning, and through going, talking through with them, you don't have to submit on that date, and you don't have to go up to that total word count. Why are you doing this? Is it something that will really benefit you in the long run, and is it something that really pushes your own learning further? Because and yourself, I mean, I graduated a little bit longer than 10 years ago, shall I say, but the one thing that always strikes me is that our students have got these amazing summers off as well, and it's about how they then go and apply that learning in the real world as well, and how it's then contextualized. Because again, quite often it can be seen as separate, can't it? You go to uni, you do your work, you go to lectures and you leave, and woohoo. But actually, how we then apply that further and how we take that learning from our assessment into society is really important as well. And I think that's how we can use flexible assessment to support our learners to think that bit wider as well, so that as we've already discussed, it's not something done to us as students, but something that we can then utilize to showcase our knowledge, but also utilize it to push forwards that knowledge as well.
I mean, it does feel really, really strange to think that actually all you need to do is demonstrate that you've met the learning outcomes, and you could do that in less. It feels strange to say that you could do that in less words, but actually you're right. You said all you need to do is have a conversation about why are you trying to hit that number, or why are you leaving it until the last moment to submit? And I think that in itself is a mature conversation. One of the things I wanted to pick up on is, in my experience, the students I've spoken to are, I'd say they're quite skeptical of things like optionality or choice in assessment. And I say that because, and I'll give you both sides of the spectrum, I guess. So when it's an initial conversation, they're like, no, because you just choose multiple choice over the presentation, or you choose multiple choice over the essay. So they're seeing it as choosing the mode of assessment, perhaps, and therefore you'd always go to the easiest one. And that, in their mind, was an unfair advantage. But when we broke it down, myself and Dr. Emma Herron, who's the head of Learning and Teaching Enhancement at UOM, we had a panel with of students discussing assessment alongside the SU. It was really interesting, really fascinating. But when we broke it down, actually, let's take the presentation as the mode of assessment. And that might be a presentation that's live. It might be a presentation that's recorded. It might be one that's on your own. It might be one that's in a group. Those are the realms in which perhaps optionality could creep in. Then they were far more open, and I could see your theory play out in real time, because they were thinking, oh, hang on, if I could perhaps choose what group to be in, I know that my strength is this and their strength is that, so I might choose the group. But equally, I also know that perhaps my performance in front of an audience isn't as strong as I'd like it to be, so I could record it in advance and submit it that way. And then you could see all the options pile up in their brain, and they were far more favourable with that. But what are your experiences of students' initial impressions of that optionality or that flexibility?
That's great. I mean, firstly, I'm just delighted to hear that that's flown and landed great, and I just love to hear of those examples. And I think that's just to remark on that, that's been one of the most joyful parts of supporting this research across the sector. And I think that's another thing to say. Lots of people were already doing this, and this was already in place. And, lots of colleagues had already either had this as part of a strategy or part of a policy. But yeah, I think my experience mirrors exactly what you've seen from both staff and students. When you talk about flexible assessment, they go mode. They jump to that, and they jump to, but why would anyone pick to write a poem as opposed to, whatever? Because it sounds like it is, firstly, more difficult, and secondly, potentially not the area that they might get the most marks in. And again, that's where we as educators, we have so much more flexibility and freedom. It's not just flexibility. I think the freedom part is really, really amazing for us. I mean, I've always taught in higher education, but my mum was in FE and in school, and my grandma was in school as well. They had no freedom over how their students were going to be assessed whatsoever. And I think it's just something that we are so fortunate with, and so rarely take that opportunity, because we can change the marking rubric. We can talk to our PSRBs and say, actually, I'm thinking of offering a group versus individual presentation. Would that still, would that be okay with you? I know it still meets the learning outcomes, but I'm just checking with my accreditor. I just think that is something that is a gift. It really is a gift that we have. And that also doesn't need any requirements in terms of the CMA changes. If we've got our assessment clear, it could be a simple tweak to a rubric where we are looking at changing part of that marking scheme, which could actually include what you've just suggested. It could include the process the students took to decide that choice or to decide that flexibility. Or it could include part of their personal reflections on why they chose this, because we can angle them. We can absolutely angle anyone through assessment through to that point. It's within our gift to either maintain a rigidity of it's always been done like this and you have to do this, and that's proving that you have met that benchmark, or let's look at developing citizens of the future that are ready for work, have worked in teams. Because again, for me, my original research and how I originally came into HE was about, we need to know what's happening out there and make sure our students in here are really developed to the best of our abilities. And my response is always, why don't we let them make these choices? They're going to have to do it when they're in work, and they're going to have to do it in society. So why are we confining them and making it so rigid and particular whilst they're with us?
Yeah. Wow. I think you are a fantastic advocate of all of this. I know I can share this with colleagues, and they will be inspired to give something a go off the back of this conversation. So thank you so much.
Delighted.
I mean, one of the questions I want to ask is based on a concept I learned yesterday about a pre-mortem. So looking ahead about things that could go wrong and sort of ironing them out in advance, rather than looking back and saying, oh, this went wrong, this went wrong. So if I bring the idea of flexible assessment or optionality to staff, and we're working on a pre-mortem, what pitfalls do we need to make them aware of? And you've already outlined one in terms of the CMA and the sort of regulatory frameworks they have to work within in terms of that. But yeah, what are some of the things staff need to look out for in terms of their own preparation or how they frame it to students to ensure that this goes as well as it can?
Absolutely, really good question, and that's really why we made the framework for flexible assessment. So anyone listening, have a look at that. It's a practical framework for you to kind of work through any of those issues. And the first part on the 4Cs will really help you internally as an institution work out what those particular tensions or issues might be. But there are quite a few things, like you've said, or we've already discussed. We need to make sure that it works within the CMA requirements. Our professional and statutory regulatory bodies, they all support this, by the way. We discussed it with them in our original study. But I think it's also important that it's discussed through all stakeholders. And the approach I would make, which is a practical example for colleagues, is that at the end of the year, when you finish teaching, yes, you look at your unit feedback, but I would look at that unit and think, okay, next year, where could I add or clarify flexible assessment in here? So I might already have it, first of all, which is great. So then it might be just to be about communicating that clearer next year and making sure that autonomy and motivation, all the brilliant things we know is possible, can then really shine from it. So that's the first thing. If it's somewhere where we think, okay, we would like to add more flexible assessment, at that point, you then need to go and talk to your stakeholders. And that's a really important part, to make sure that you've then discussed it with colleagues across the programme, your professional services colleagues, accreditors, external examiners. Float the idea, see what their response is, and see where any of their points then raise any flags or any issues to them, embed that. Then included in that, talk to the students that have currently completed that unit. And I think that's a really important stage that is quite often overlooked. Quite often colleagues will look at student feedback through end of term surveys and then go, well, I'm now going to do this. I would always advocate for checking in with those students verbally and saying, I've had this feedback, I'm thinking of doing this. Is that right? Because we can all misunderstand, we can all get the perceptions of feedback incorrectly, and where flexibility is involved, it's really important that it lands right to gain those really good positive outcomes. So that's what I would do on a unit level, certainly. I'd look at it programmatically as well. And I think one of the really good benefits we're seeing at the moment is where programs are then confirming that in Welcome Week and saying, our university has this policy supporting your varied learning needs and varied learning differences, and that's why we have flexible assessment. You will see it in your program in X, Y, and Z. So you unearth it and extract it like I talked about in November. And then strategically, the universities that have done this in wider policy, I would then look about having champions and think about how they can then champion flexible assessment on programs and in disciplines. But it's always context specific and context dependent, and that's really not a cop-out answer, but it's why I'm working individually with a number of institutions, because if we'd have just launched the project, if we'd just done the framework and leave it sat there, A, it wouldn't fly as well as it could do, and B, it wouldn't have those nuances considered, where I've got the expertise to know all of the background to the research, all the background to the framework, and go, well, hang on, actually this can mean that. And that's why I think colleagues are really jumping on this and doing some incredible things. And I'm genuinely just really, really fortunate to be able to do this. I absolutely love my job. I couldn't do anything else. I just think it's just such a fantastic thing to do.
That shines through on everywhere I see you. That definitely stands out to me. Look, I'd be really surprised if you were the advocate of flexible assessment and then told me it could only be done in one way. So I'm not surprised that there are, there's nuances and there's individual context to consider in all of that. Look, my final two questions. I know you got to leave soon. The first one is, what are you curious about right now in AI? In a couple bullet points, what's really got your attention today about AI? Because I've got a free weekend and I want to do some learning. So yeah.
So I am really loving working with colleagues at Cloudforce. I don't know if you've come across their work
Not yet.
in creating agents and stuff, but I love their work. You'll probably have, if you've got Copilot in your institution,
Yeah.
you might have access to Cloudforce. And I love the idea of it's not quite coding, it's instructing, prompting your version of AI to then answer in certain ways. And I just find that really fascinating. And I think we're going to end up having more entertainment and comedy sets where you've actually coded your AI to respond in certain ways, and things like that. I just think it's fascinating, and the work that Cloudforce is doing is really incredible in that front. So I'd look to do that because I just find it really interesting and fascinating.
That is, I'll tell you what, the light bulb you've lit in my brain there has been, I look at AI through a utilitarian lens. What productivity can it do for me? But you've mentioned comedy and entertainment there. So I'm going to look at that this weekend and see what I can learn about that development in AI. And my final question is, one thing I absolutely love about your LinkedIn is every week you're either acquiring a new award or you've developed a new title. And I just want to know, this weekend, what's your award or what's your new title? Who is Dr. Miri Firth this weekend?
This weekend, wow. Well, I am going to an awards due next Tuesday. My students have nominated me, and I cannot
I
wait.
love
And I'm
that.
going to tell you about that because it honestly means the world to me. Not just that my students go on to brilliant things, which is the absolute main central, focal point for me. It's the fact that they're recognizing that they're getting outstanding student experience. It's not just me, it's a room full of people that are just doing wicked stuff that I get to learn from. But next week and this weekend that's leading into it, I'm really excited because I'm going to be, did I tell you this, that I theme my weekly work outfits as well? Have I
No,
told you this?
tell me more.
So this week it's Monet, so I'm in lots of watercolors. But for next week, because I've got this awards due happening, I'm going to go for a bit of punky sport, bright colors. So I've bought a load of Adidas vintage clothes, and this weekend I'm going to be sewing stuff for my awards night on Tuesday, and I'm going to come in like this really vibrant Adidas top and skirt and stuff, and I'm sewing it all together.
That is so Manchester. That is so
It
Manchester.
is, isn't it?
Like that. Yeah. Do you know what? It's completely on brand. And I'm so glad we had this conversation on a Friday because you've lifted me for the weekend. Dr. Miri Firth, I'll put your details in the description so people can follow your LinkedIn as they choose. It genuinely is one of the most value-packed LinkedIns I've found in higher education. So thank you for all you do for the sector. Your generosity does not go unnoticed. Have a great weekend. This has been Before Our Friends Die. You've been joined by me, Kavan, and this, of course, is the akhi&saltfish Digital Network. If you've got any comments or questions, please do email me, akhi&saltfish@gmail.com, and I'd love to get back to you. Take care and goodbye.